In this unit, we're going to start to take a look at the origins of some civilizations that will influence the Greek mainland. As we look at Greece and we think about the Golden Age that we're going to talk about, we think about the formation of Sparta and Athens, we need to go back and figure out, in part, where did they come from? What were the origins of some of their ideas that led them on to greatness? In that context, there's two different civilizations we're going to look at to try and understand where the Greeks were starting from, if that makes sense. And in one case, what we're going to do is we're going to go out into the Mediterranean, and we're going to go to an island called Crete. Crete is off the mainland of Greece, out in the Mediterranean Sea, so it's not part of the mainland. And it's going to be an interesting place for us to take a look at, especially a famous city there named Knossos. And Knossos, you'll sometimes see it spelled slightly differently depending on the text you're using, but they're talking about the same city on the island of Crete that was very active and very powerful in the time period from the sort of the end of the age of bronze and into the age of iron. So we are talking about an island civilization that was on the island of Crete, and it was discovered in part because there was a mania, sort of a craze, if you would, a fad, in the 19th century for many wealthy Europeans, especially French, British, and German men, to go and read the ancient texts of Greek history and Greek literature and Roman too, and wanting to go and find those locations, to go and see if they could pair up the literature and the stories they're reading with actual places around the Mediterranean. So people like Heinrich Schliemann and Sir Arthur Evans are going to go and find places. They're going to discover and do some serious archaeology. And then that archaeology, like we've talked about, that archaeological evidence then will be paired up with law codes, stories of warfare, and literature. And through all these different means, we'll come to a better historical understanding of places like the island of Crete. Now, what's fascinating about the island of Crete is that there is this, like I said, large city called Knossos. It appears to have virtually no military fortifications at all. Rather strange, since most of the other cities and other civilizations we've talked about so far have had a significant military presence. Many of them have created very sophisticated military machines in terms of walls and fortifications and moats. Lots and lots of different ways in which military technology has been suitable to help protect those places. So here's a relatively wealthy, it appears, civilization called the Minoans on the island of Crete, and they do not seem to have any significant military fortifications. Now, historians are kind of wondering about that. There's two simple explanations. One, they didn't have time and it just never happened. But it appears as if this civilization lasted a very long time. So then it would lead us to another sort of deduction, which is, well, maybe they didn't fear anybody. Maybe their control of the sea, maybe their control of sea lanes was such that they didn't fear any significant military outside invasion. So why would you invest a significant amount of time, energy, and money in military walls that were not useful or not needed? Anyway, what's also interesting about the palace at Knossos is it seems to be relatively sophisticated in its construction. There is in the basement of it, a lower level, there is essentially a labyrinth, a huge number of rooms in the bottom of this palace where there are just room after room after room, and we're way past thinking about it as like a military barracks or a monastery. It appears to be a depot, a place to store goods, olive oil, grain, whatever was necessary. It appears as if this palace complex had some system whereby they were gathering in grain, wine, olive oil, whatever food production there is out there, having it come to the central palace and then be redistributed somehow. Whether people were paying in kind as a kind of taxation, or it's obscure. There's been lots of speculation, but the archaeological evidence is of a very complex palace with very, very large number of rooms that all seem to be somehow used as storerooms for goods. It's led to lots of speculation, but what is interesting is combining the idea that it has its own writing system, okay, called a linear script, and they have this large trade network, and they do not seem to fear any outsiders. This seems to lead us to believe that this was a very stable civilization. It had a very complex trade network, and we're going to see their materials that they've transported around the Mediterranean. And then at some point, this civilization did dissolve or was taken over by outsiders, and it appears as if these were people who came from the mainland. All right? But we're going to see some of the elements of their architecture and of their script and some of their ideas pass on to the next Greek city-state. That's when we start to take a look at the Mycenaeans. Mycenaean civilization is on the mainland of Greece itself. So we've now finally, after talking about civilizations in Asia and in Africa and in the islands of the Aegean Sea off of the coast of Greece, we finally have landed in Europe. We're now talking about a European-based civilization. All right? So the process of Western civilization so far is taking us from the east to the west. And many of the ideas and concepts from Asia and Africa will be adopted and will be adapted by the Europeans to come. What I mean by adopt is they'll pick up and use them. For example, the Phoenician alphabet. And then after they've adopted them, they will adapt them. They'll change it, they'll add some accent marks, they may create a new letter. But nonetheless, the origins of it are clear. In the case of the Mycenaeans, this is a very different civilization. They have a different linear script, okay? A different writing system that later on will be cracked. We will be able to read most of it, unlike the one on the island of Crete in Minoan civilization. On the mainland at Mycenae, we have a very different Greek society, and we know a lot about them because they left behind a lot of monumental architecture. And what they did leave behind is large fortress-like structures, castle-like structures, if you want it. And these are military fortifications. And from some of the graves of some of the leaders of Mycenae that we have found, we find that their burial practices, like that of the Egyptians, was to have somebody buried with lots of implements. Their war implements, bows and arrows, spears and shields, or in other cases, tables, chairs, plates, food, right? That there's some kind of concept that those who have died need those to transition into the new world of the dead or of their concept of heaven or whatever it is. But what's interesting is when those societies did that with their burial practices, they leave behind for historians like us and archaeologists tools, concepts, metalwork, ceramics, woven materials, jewelry, all kinds of artifacts that we can use to understand how those societies functioned. In the case of the Mycenaean civilization, we seem to have a civilization which is a warrior state. That these men who are buried in these burial chambers are in full military regalia. They have their shield and all their other weapons with them, which would be extremely valuable and very useful, but they are put with the dead, and there is some kind of concept there that they're going to need them in the next life. But what's interesting now is we have a Minoan civilization in Crete. We now have a Mycenaean civilization on the mainland. It appears as if the Mycenaeans took over the Minoans at some point and carried with them their ideas and concepts. And then, in the time period that is to come, the exact history gets fuzzy. Because in many places in and around the Mediterranean, roughly around the year 1200 BCE, there is a large-scale series of raids and wars where there's some outside group that comes into this area and destroys many of the civilizations that had been stabilized by about 1200 BCE. We know from Egyptian readings, we also know from archaeological evidence that roughly at the same time, some kind of outsider, who sometimes are referred to as simply the sea people, come in and challenge all these civilizations on the edges of the Mediterranean Sea and physically obliterate many of them. This is a late Bronze Age, early Iron Age concept, and we've been trying to figure it out, and we're trying to find the archaeological evidence and marry it up with information we know from other sources. And this is where we want to talk in Greek civilization and culture about the ideas of Homer, all right? Homer is a poet, a sage, a wise man, a philosopher, a writer, a reciter. Remember, we're talking about an oral culture for many civilizations comes before the writing systems, right? We've talked about the creation of writing systems in various civilizations. And that is usually the culmination of a larger, older oral tradition, the storyteller tradition that exists in many cultures. Literacy, the ability to write down those stories, comes later. What we think we have in the case of Homer is somewhere in the edge of that ancient Iron Age from the Bronze Age. We have a story, a compelling story of warfare and strife and struggle between humans, between gods and other gods, between gods and humans. A very complex story, and it's based on two surviving epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Two classic texts that you may find sometimes referred to in English courses or in literature courses. They have a compelling story. There's a significant amount of drama in them, lots of study on the nature of the idea of truth and justice, right? Concepts that exist in every human society. But what's interesting about the Iliad and about the Odyssey is that they focus on the great deeds of ancient Greek soldiers. And in essence, for some of you who might know the story, a woman named Helen is kidnapped. She's taken to a city in what looks like Turkey, right, referred to as Asia Minor, the city of Troy. And the story is of the Greek military men organizing to go and conduct a war with the Trojans. And the story is compelling, and I won't do a spoiler alert. I'm not gonna tell you how it ends. But what I would like to focus on for a second is inside Homer's work, both the Iliad and the Odyssey. On one hand, there's a compelling story. It's interesting, it's great literature, it makes for great movies. On the other hand, there's a couple other things we want to point to. One, Homer, in the process of telling a story, is also going to give us the sort of idea of a perfect man. And what is a perfect man? What is a real man like in his culture, in his society? What you see is that the Homer that we know lays out an idea that a real Greek man is an independent warrior. He's generous and kind with his fellow soldiers. He follows orders. He knows his place in the world. He knows that his duty is to serve and that his duty is potentially to even die in the service of his king or of his clan. And inside the story of the Iliad, there's a constant reinforcing of the idea of sort of like a real Greek man as a successful warrior, all right? Physically fit, mentally tough. And on the other side, there's also the ideal woman of Greek society. And the women characters that are mentioned in both the Iliad and the Odyssey are idealized, much like the men are, into the dutiful mother, the obedient and wonderful wife, and the excellent housekeeper. And inside the Iliad, just to make the example, there is a story of one of the princes involved having a conversation with his wife. And he talks about his duty. And she's very fearful that he will go forth that day and in battle die. And she will be left a widow. And the conclusion to the story essentially is, the man says that he must go and do his duty, even if it means his death, even if it means that fate will take him today, and she will be left a widow and their child an orphan. But he cannot stay back. He cannot not accept the challenge. He has to go forth. And he admonishes her and he lets her know, I need to go do this. This is what a real Greek man does. And you are going to stay here with the child. You're going to oversee the servants. You're going to spin and cook and clean. Now, these are highly idealized and highly stylized stereotypes, but they're powerful because when we see later on in Greek society and culture, the idea that people are going to be using this as a way to think about the life that they lead, it is a life of struggle, okay? And here's a sort of an idealized boxing match. But the idea I want to close with here, using the early Minoan and Mycenaean and now ideas of Homer, okay? All three of those things have led us to a world of strife and struggle, a world of trying to master resources. The idea here that we're depicting is a human-on-human struggle, and it appears to be a boxing match. But what's also interesting in the Iliad and later in the follow-up book, the Odyssey, is that not only are humans in conflict with each other over justice and what is right and what is wrong, and fairness, and resources, and fidelity, they also are at war with the gods. Because in the Greek conception of religion, and we'll spend some more time on this as we go forward, the gods and goddesses are not aloof, living off somewhere. They are like the gods that we see in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. They participate. They are constantly involved in the lives of human people. And that's a very different kind of religious faith that they're going to be developing in Greece, where the idea of, say, free will, salvation, judgment day, that were very powerful ideas in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, are largely absent in Greek religious belief. Greek religious belief is polytheistic, it's ritualistic, but it's also going to be very strange in the sense that at times humans and gods are in battle with each other. Not theoretically, I mean hand-to-hand combat, and we know the god is going to win. Take a look at this area of your text. Make sure you have an understanding of how early Greek ideas and concepts from both Minoan and Mycenaean and Homer, all three of those come together to offer you a better structure of looking at early Greek development, and make sure that you take a look also at your practice questions.